Father, thank you for this day that we could be here. Be with us now, Lord, as we enter into the life of your people, Israel, Lord, of whom we now are a part. May we see our story in theirs. In your name, amen. We are just going to jump right into it. I said last week that we're looking at the book of Exodus, and we're seeing how it relates to the Christian story, that it really is the unfolding story of God's plan for redemption. But there's two problems when we step into the Old Testament. And the first one is that we think about, most of us, even if we only think about it subconsciously, is that we think as New Testament believers, we think that God's story began in the New Testament. We think it begins with Jesus. And so we kind of think about the Old Testament as like the foundational story, something that needed to happen, but we don't think of it as our story. The reality is that God's mission begins in Genesis 1 and it ends in Revelation, and so the unfolding story in the Old Testament is not just foundational to the real story, it is the real story. It is the story of God's redemption of which we are a part. And so when we come to it, we have to do some work to figure out where these stories fit within the chronology and the history of God's redemptive plan. They're not just, one-off stories or stories that, like, well, David and Goliath, God will help you conquer your giants. Like, that's not what that story means. That's nice if it makes you feel better, but that's not what's going on there, but that's the way we tend to view Old Testament stories. The second issue is what I called missing the trees for the forest. See, we know what it means to miss the forest for the trees. When we miss the forest for the trees, we focus on details, but we don't see the big picture. And that's the way that most of us approach the Bible, because we like the short little quippy statements that we can, knit into a pillow. Because those, so even we do it in the New Testament, right? Philippians, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Isn't that fit? Wow, that's good. But it's really a call to be content with whatever your circumstances bring, even if your circumstances stink. But if you took that one verse out, you might think something about it that's not really true because you've missed the forest for the trees. Or when we come even to the Old Testament, we look at Jeremiah, and, I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to give you a hope and a future. And we're like, oh, thank goodness. When life is hard, I just think about the things I hope for, and I'm assured that God will give them to me. That's unfortunately failed to recognize that God has written that through the prophet Jeremiah to a people who are in exile. And by the way, the people that he's talking to, most of them are going to die there and never see the hope that they think they wanted. Like the way they interpreted that was that we would return to the promised land. And many of them, if not most, were going to die in exile. That's not the hope. God wasn't talking about the hope of returning to the promised land. God was talking about a different sort of hope. Hope within the midst of the exile, but they may have thought something else. So the point is that when we come to the Old Testament, or more often than not, when we come to a story like the one we're studying, we know the broad story. Israel gets rescued from Egypt. They wander around in the wilderness. They end up in the promised land. We know the broad story. We know the forest, but we don't know the trees. We don't know the details. We fail to see the details, and so as a result, we end up with a vision of God's unfolding story and of Christ himself that is at least less significant than it could be, if not purely deficient. We need to see the details within the story. We need to look and see what's going on. And so my hope is that to help us see that in the series, but it's going to require a bit of groundwork. And so today we're going to be looking at the next section in the story of Exodus. And one of the challenges of this sermon in particular is that it's 2.5 chapters long, this section we're looking at. And so I have to deal with how much of this do I summarize for you, and how much of it do I read to you and then explain. And so I'm going to do a little bit of both, and hopefully that will best capture what's going on in this story. So when we left Moses last week, he had been adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh, was given the name Moses, which, if you remember, means that he was drawn out of water. It also has this connection with the Egyptian word for son. And so Moses is a son drawn from the water. Well, the very next story we read is a story of Moses fleeing from Egypt. And let me read it to us. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Between Genesis 2, verse 10 and Genesis 2, verse 11, it's just a sentence for us. But we discover later in Scripture that 40 years have passed in Moses' life, from the time that he's been drawn out of the river to the time that he walks out to view the plight of his own people and ends up killing this Egyptian and flees to Midian. In his sermon right before he dies, Stephen, who's the first martyr of the church, says this in Acts 7, "When he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel." So we know that Moses is 40 years old. We're given no information on his upbringing. Nothing is said about what it was like to grow up in Pharaoh's, empire, to grow up in the palace, about how Moses lived, how he experienced this. All we know is that he is an adult, and here's the key. Despite everything that he's experienced, he sees the Hebrews as his people. He says when he sees one of his people being beaten by this taskmaster, one of his people being wronged, he intervenes. And then the story takes an immediate turn, and we discover that when Moses tries to intervene between two people, he's rejected. This is not a lesson on leadership right here that I'm giving, but it is surprising how many times that in leadership you try to defend one group of people and then something changes and they begin attacking you. And you say, "Didn't I just defend you a second ago?" And they go, "Yeah, but now we don't like you because now you're standing against me." And you find yourself stuck in between two opposing groups of people. But here, the Hebrew person says, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us?" That question is piercing not just to Moses, but would have been piercing to the person who heard this story passed down orally. It's jarring to us. Who made Moses prince and judge over the people of Israel? That's the question that we need to be asking ourselves. We have some idea, even if the people who heard this story originally knew, even if the people in this story knew that Moses was a Hebrew, even if this story of Moses being drawn from the water and adopted into Pharaoh's house had been passed around the community, what they saw, what these two Hebrew people saw when they looked at Moses, was a person with Egyptian privilege. He had Egyptian privilege. Moses was the sort of person who felt like he could kill a man and get away with it. And the Hebrews knew it. So the story gets back to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh now seeks to have Moses killed. But the question is, why? Why did Pharaoh want to see Moses killed? The text does not answer the question. It could be simply because Moses had committed murder. But it doesn't seem like, from this story and what we know of Pharaoh, that Pharaoh's regime was one of compassion ruled by justice. A regime in which slaves were forcibly beaten. If the Hebrew had died at the hand of this Egyptian, would he have faced death himself? Or was it because, in Pharaoh's mind, he knew that Moses was a Hebrew, and he was, in essence, waiting for Moses to pick a side? That he's known for Moses' whole life, that Moses was this Hebrew drawn out of the water. And now that Moses had picked a side, perhaps the Pharaoh had spared his life because it was his daughter's adopted son. But now Moses had shown an allegiance to the Hebrews, and Pharaoh was not going to allow for an insurrection. And so he seeks out Moses' life. Moses' life is in danger, and he flees to Midian, which is in the wilderness. And as he arrives, he sits down at a well. Now, if you were a Hebrew person hearing this story, or if you were reading it as a Hebrew, alarm bells would start to go off in your head. What is Moses doing at a well? In Genesis 24, Abraham calls his most trusted servant to himself, and he says essentially to this servant, he says, "I want you to go to the land of the east where I came from, and I want you to find a wife for my son Isaac." And so the servant goes out, and lo and behold, he camps himself at a well. And who comes out to the well but a beautiful young woman named Rebekah, who would become Isaac's wife? Then in Genesis 29, Isaac's son Jacob goes on a journey himself. And what does he come upon but a well? And as he's at the well, out to the well, comes a beautiful young woman named Rachel, who would become his wife. And so here we are, and here is Moses, and he has fled his land, and he's gone to the east, just as Abraham's servant had done, just as Jacob had done. And where does he find himself? He finds himself at a well. And so you're not only thinking something's about to happen, but you're thinking Moses might be about to meet his wife, which is exactly what happens. 7 women come out. Moses defends them from some rogue shepherds. He's invited back to their father's house, who also happens to be the priest of Midian, which I will say this. I don't have a lot of time to go into it, but Moses' father-in-law being the priest of Midian. Who's the priest of Midian? It doesn't give us a lot to go on, but let me say this. Spoiler alert, Moses is about to spend 40 years in the wilderness underneath the mountain of God, which is located in Midian. And Jethro, his father-in-law, is a priest of Midian. If you go back and you read the Old Testament, the story traces itself through God's people Israel. But there are moments in the story where it becomes clear that God is working through other people. And is it another religion? Is Jethro a priest of the one true God, the way Melchizedek is in the story of Abraham? We don't know. But don't miss that God is working through other people. Something else significant that happens in this story is that as Moses is at the well, the daughters of Jethro of Midian come out, and they identify Moses as an Egyptian. They go back to their father and they say, there's this Egyptian sitting at the well. And there's this juxtaposition that's happening in the story where Moses identifies himself as a Hebrew, and yet as he goes out to the well, the daughters of Jethro see him as an Egyptian. They see him as someone else. Moses moves somewhat seamlessly between Egyptians and Hebrews, between the place of his upbringing and the place of his origin. Here's the conclusion to this story, Exodus 2:21. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to his son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. Just let that resonate. Moses goes out to the wilderness and is given a son, and he names him, I will be a sojourner in a foreign land. During those many days, we read, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Once again, we're given one sentence to describe the period of time that Moses spends in the wilderness. It's just the turn of a page for us. How long was it really? Again, from Stephen in Acts chapter 7, now when 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in a flame of fire in a bush. The many days of Genesis were 40 years. But here's the key. God saw and God knew. What are we to make of that? See, I want us to meditate on that for a minute. What are we to make about the fact that God saw and God knew? On the one hand, that statement should give us so much confidence in the compassion of our God. You know, God sees you. God knows. One of the names for God that's given in Genesis 16 is the story of a woman named Hagar. Maybe you'll remember. God has come to Abram and his wife Sarai and said, I'm going to give you a child, and they laugh about it. How's that possible? We're as old as the hills. We're as old as dirt. It's never going to happen. Sarah goes to Abraham and says, listen, I haven't had a child my whole life. I'm well beyond the age when I should be having children. I'm going to give you my maidservant, Hagar, my servant woman, my slave, Hagar, and you can go have a child with her, and then that will become the child of the promise. So Abraham does. He goes in with Hagar. They have a child together. They name him Ishmael. Immediately, Sarah is extremely upset that Hagar has gotten pregnant. She becomes jealous. She begins treating her harshly. And so Hagar runs away into the wilderness. And as she's out there essentially saying, I'm going to die, I have no provision, an angel of the Lord shows up and not only provides for her, but gives her this promise that God will protect her. And Hagar says, surely this is El Roi. This is the God who sees, because God has seen me. And now here we are, and the people discover, and we discover as the reader, that God sees and God knows. It should give us comfort, but the problem is, it's been 400 years. 400 years of God seeing. It's now been 80 years since Moses was born. We know that Moses was going to rescue them. We know that Moses is going to lead them out of Egypt. We know that as the readers, we know as the reader that Moses was the one who was appointed judge and prince over these people, but they don't know that. Living in this story, what good does it do you that God sees and God knows? It's a great comfort to us because we just turned the page, and there God was. But for the people in Israel, they'd been groaning for generations, and so as you meditate on this, ask yourself, how long have you waited on God? Do we still believe that God sees and knows, even if the situation we're struggling with continues on day after day, despite our prayers? Do you still believe that God knows and sees you when even, like Paul said of his thorn in the flesh, the weakness that Joey read about this morning, even if we may never be rid of those things in this life, you may never be rid of that thing that feels oppressive to you. Do you still believe that God sees and God knows? All we've really established at this point is the context into which perhaps the most famous event of Moses' life comes into perspective. We've traced the chronology, the history, the significance, but at this point, as Exodus 2 comes to a close, Moses has no idea what God's purposes for his life are. Moses is perfectly content living in Midian. He's got a new wife, he's got a kid, he's got a job. He's like, this is cool. Far away from the privilege of Egypt, he doesn't have to worry about his people being tortured every day, he doesn't have to see it. He's like, this is fine with me. I'll take the wilderness all day, every day. I'm good. And that's how Exodus 3 opens as we see Moses in the wilderness. Let me read verse 1 of Exodus 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Chances are you know what happens at this part of the story. This is one of those parts that I'm not going to read to you. I'm just going to summarize, because even if you don't have a knowledge of the history of the Old Testament, most people know that Moses is out in the wilderness and God appears to him in a bush, except that's on fire. Except the bush is not really on fire. God is in the flame. God shows up, tells Moses to take off his sandals. He approaches. God identifies himself. You know this story. He's out there doing his thing, 40 years since he left Egypt, and out of nowhere there's a bush that's on fire. God says to Moses, I've heard the groans of my people, and I'm going to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians, and I'm sending you to do it. Here's Moses' response in Exodus 3, verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? If you've been paying attention at all, for the first 2 chapters of Exodus, the last 2 weeks of sermons, your response to this should be, what are you, stupid, Moses? What are you, stupid? Who are you? Raised in the Pharaoh's household, educated under the finest Egyptian scholarship, full knowledge of Egyptian language and culture, able to walk seamlessly amongst the Egyptians, and yet a person of Hebrew descendants, a person who identifies with the Hebrew people. Moses knew exactly who he was. He already knew the answer to this question. Who am I? Who do you think you are, Moses? It's just that he spent 40 years in the wilderness convincing himself that all of the reasons, convinced himself of all the reasons that none of that mattered. You don't think he took some time to reflect on the fact that here he was when he walked out as a 40-year-old man and he saw his people being tortured and he thought about all the power that he had? You don't think he spent the last 40 years now in the wilderness thinking about how he had to live with that burden of being a person of power in Egypt as his own people suffered? You don't think he spent 40 years in the wilderness trying to run away from the fact that he acknowledged and recognized his own privilege that he was given in order to go back and save these people? He just hoped it'd never come up again. That's why he's on the lam for 40 years. I hope no one brings it up. Burying his head in the metaphorical sand, hoping to just die out here with no need to confront what God has clearly been preparing him for his whole life, including and leading up to this point, standing under the mountain of God. Here's how God responds. He says, "But I will be with you." He doesn't even respond to Moses' question, by the way, which is why I think God's like, don't be an idiot. It's not in the text, it's a paraphrase. "But I will be with you, and this will be a sign for you that I've sent you. When you've brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." Here's going to be the sign to you. I'm not going to answer that question. Here's how you're going to know, though. After you've gone and brought out the people, you're going to lead them back through this wilderness that you've spent the last 40 years in. You're going to lead them back through the trails and the valleys and the pathways that you've spent 40 years learning about and discovering. You're going to lead them back through this land that you've been preparing yourself for the last 40 years, to this mountain that you've been grazing under the feet of for 40 years. And you're going to guide these people back under this mountain, and they're going to worship me here. What God says to him is, "Moses, you already know why it's you. But what I'm going to show you is that for the last 40 years, I've been preparing you in the quiet, allowing you to get the lay of the land. While you thought you were shepherding sheep, I was preparing you to shepherd a people." Moses goes on to ask God another question. I don't think it's a question of doubt, by the way. I think that's the way we read it sometimes. I think but I think it's actually a question of acknowledgement. I think it's a question of resignation to the fact that this request is in front of him, that he will go back to Pharaoh and demand the release of these people. He may not want to understand it, but I think he gets it, because what he asks is an incredibly bold question. God has already told Moses who he is. In Exodus 3, verse 6, God says to Moses, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hides his face, for he's afraid to look at God. Moses knows exactly who it is in the bush. He already knows when he says, "Who am I that you would send me?" He already knows when God says, "I'll go with you." But Moses immediately responds with this question. He knows all the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he responds with this question. He goes, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me,' and they ask you, 'What is his name?' what shall I say?" What is your name? Moses has the audacity to ask the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the bush, a bush that's on fire but not burning, and he has the audacity to say to him, "What is your name?" One of the most famous and powerful scenes from the book Roots and later in the movie is when the slave master is trying to force Kunta Kinte to call himself by his new name. To call himself by a name that would resign him to slavery, to admit that his new name is who he really is, and he refuses as he's being whipped because he says, "My name is Kunta Kinte, and you can't take my identity from me." Names matter. What your name is matters. The story begins with God calling out Moses' name. Moses. Moses' name mattered. When God calls him from the bush, he's calling out into the wilderness, "Son, whom I have drawn out of the water. My son, standing at the foot of the mountain of God, whom I have drawn out of the water, are you there?" And now Moses, not in defiance, not in doubt, but I think even boldly and courageously says to God, if you are going to say my name to me, then you better tell me your name. I know what you've done. I know you're the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I know the stories, but what I want to know is, who are you? What is your name? Identify yourself to me. And by the way, it wasn't because Moses wouldn't have known God's personal name. Every time, you probably know this, that you read in your English translation the word Lord, but capitalized L-O-R-D. It's a translation, an interpretation, a transcription of the Hebrew name for God, his personal name, Yahweh. It's written L-O-R-D in capital L's. The word Lord, the word Yahweh, is used various times in Genesis leading up to this story. It could be that that's because later on, when Genesis was written down, the people knew what God's personal name was, and so they wrote it back into the text. But in all likelihood, it was because the people already knew how God identified himself and what his personal name was. Now, it's been 400 years. Maybe it's been in disuse. Maybe Moses didn't remember, but I think more likely is that Moses knew exactly what God's name was, and when he stood at the bush, he said, are you going to identify yourself to me? If this is going to be the thing that we're doing, are you going to tell me who you are? God answers, Exodus 3:14. God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, so say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me to you. What does it mean to be I am who I am? What does I am mean? It means that I am the one who bears no definition. I am the one who doesn't need defining. I am the creator and the sustainer of the universe. I am the one that stands above time, both past, now, and forevermore. I am means I am God. It means all of those things, and yet it's beyond that, and that's the point. It's beyond your comprehension to think about what does it mean, other than the fact that when God stands there and says, who am I? He says, I am. That's the sort of God I am. And Yahweh tells Moses that he's going to go to Pharaoh. He's going to demand that Pharaoh let the people go. And not only will Pharaoh let them go, but that when the people leave, they're going to plunder the people of Egypt, which is exactly what happens. So Moses returns. He continues to resist, rattling off all the excuses to God that he'd been working on for the last 40 years. You can't say, I don't talk good. You can't send me, I don't know what. And God's like, look, I got signs, it's going to be fine. Like, just get over it. Finally, he says, remember your brother Aaron? Your brother Aaron, he's a Levite. Who else is a Levite? Moses is a Levite. But Aaron is called out specifically to be a prophet. I've got to be a mouthpiece here. He says, remember your brother Aaron, I'll send him with you. He'll be your mouthpiece. It's going to be like you're the divine, God says to Moses. I'm going to make you like you're a god, and Aaron like he's your prophet. So Moses relents. He goes back to when father-in-law asks him if he can go back to Egypt. Jethro blesses him, and on the way, God gives Moses one more reminder of what he's called to do. Exodus 4, verse 21. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Listen to this. He hasn't said this before. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, watch and see. I will kill your firstborn son. At a lodging place on the way, the story continues. The Lord, capital L-O-R-D, Yahweh, the one who just introduced himself to Moses, at a lodging place on the way, Yahweh meets Moses and sought to put him to death. What? What is happening? Then Zipporah, his wife, took a flint. Zipporah, his foreign-born wife, not a Hebrew. Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. So Yahweh let him alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood, because of the circumcision. God has referred to the Hebrew people up to this point as the people of Israel. He's referred to them as his people, but now, all of a sudden, the language changes as Moses is on his way to Egypt. Go to Pharaoh, and here's what you're going to tell him. You're going to let my firstborn son go, or I'm going to kill his firstborn son. That's what God's laying down. You want to know what we're dealing with? Either you let mine go, or I'm going to kill yours. And then there's this story that feels like a really weird aside, but it's incredibly powerful. Yahweh, the God who's just identified himself to Moses, is now going to kill Moses. Why? Because Moses has not circumcised his firstborn child. Moses has not signified the mark of the covenant by the shedding of blood. Moses, despite knowing about the covenant with Abraham, that everyone in the household, all the males in the household would be circumcised, for some reason, Moses' son is not circumcised. Why? Is it because he doesn't want him to be identified as a Hebrew? Is it because he just failed to live into the covenant? I don't want to press too hard on this point, but it's going to be a theme throughout the rest of Exodus. It's a continued theme in the Hebrew Scripture overall. I know we live in America, where it's all about individualism. It's all about what I want to do. It's all about me and my personal faith in Jesus Christ. So I don't want to press too hard on it. But don't miss that the expectation of Moses is that the child of his foreign-born wife would receive the covenant of the circumcision, the sign of the covenant, because Moses himself was a member of the covenant. It was an expectation that a child born into the household of a person of the covenant, even if it was only the head of the household, would receive the sign. And because Moses had not been faithful in that way, his very life was at stake. God does not make covenant with persons. You hear? God does not make covenant with individual people. God did not make a covenant with Abraham. God made a covenant with Abraham and his people and his children and his children's children. God did not make a covenant here. He doesn't make a promise to Moses. He makes a promise to Moses and his household. So now God is going to come and he's going to kill Moses. Because he says, I've sent you on a mission to identify with my people. But even after I came and called you out from the bush, even after I drew you out of the water, even after I did all these things to you, you did not take part in the sign of my covenant. And his wife, Zipporah, knows that he didn't do it. And she goes and she circumcises Moses' son. And she says, now indeed, you are a bridegroom of blood for me because of the sign of the circumcision. Now indeed, you are the one we have shed blood over this. The shedding of blood was the means through which the people would be saved. And Moses has failed to apply the sign of that covenant with God in his own household. Now, in the near context, what this points us to is when God says, he looks at Pharaoh and he says, listen, you're either going to let my firstborn son go or I'm going to kill yours. The statement is immediately followed by the shedding of blood. That's what happened here. God says, go to Pharaoh, tell him this, and then immediately after that, there's the shedding of blood of the firstborn son of Moses. And in the near context, we know, and you may know, that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. The people are not released, and the final plague comes upon Egypt. And every firstborn son in the kingdom is killed as the shadow of death passes over, except for those who took the blood of a spotless lamb and painted it on their doorposts. It was a covenant of blood. They painted it on, except it wouldn't be their own blood. It wouldn't be their blood that would associate them with the covenant to be God's people. It will be the blood of a stand-in, the blood of a lamb. The shedding of blood covered the people so that their firstborn could be saved. A firstborn son. The story of the gospel and of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection would be magnificent enough even if you had no understanding of the story I just told you. The story of the gospel can be comprehended by people all across the globe from every nation, tribe, tongue, exactly who it was intended to be. In fact, Samuel Escobar writes in one of his books that one of the great beauties of traveling the globe as a missionary or a theologian is that every culture he goes into, he sees paintings of Jesus, and they're always painted to look like the culture in which the Christians reside. And he says that's exactly as it should be, because when we come to the life of Jesus Christ, we see ourselves. But now we have taken a step back and considered the rest of God's unfolding plan. God declares the salvation of his firstborn son, and if Pharaoh will not comply, then Pharaoh's firstborn will perish. The salvation of God's people will be dependent upon the firstborn son. And then we come to the face of Jesus, and we discover that Jesus is God's own Son, the only begotten Son of the Father, the only one who shares in God's fundamental essence. The Son of God isn't born of the Father, but he shares in the Father's essence, standing in relation to him the way that a son would stand to his father. And we come to the face of Jesus, the Son of God, the image of the invisible God. And as we read in Paul in Romans, he says, "But God did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all." We discover in the gospel that for God to rescue us once and for all, not from physical slavery, but from the slavery and oppression of sin, it's going to require a firstborn son. Only it's not your firstborn son. It's not the firstborn son of Pharaoh. It's God's firstborn son. The blood that is shed, that we paint over the doorposts of our homes. The blood that we paint, the blood that was shed, is the blood of the eternal Lamb of God. And so when we come to Jesus and we want to know, who are you? Tell me who you are. What's your name? Identify yourself to us. And Jesus says, as people are demanding this of him in John chapter 8, "You're telling me that you're better than Moses? You're telling me that you're better than Abraham?" And Jesus looks at the crowd and he goes, "Before Abraham was, I am." That's why he was killed. Jesus is God. Jesus is the one who saves. He's the I am who doesn't visit in a bush and call off prophets. He's the I am who doesn't tell someone else his firstborn son would die. He's the I am who comes as the firstborn son to die, to shed the blood that you should have shed. Do you see it? The unfolding story of God. Colossians 1. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he's before all things, and in him all things hold together, and he's the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning. What else is he the firstborn from? The firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. That is the message of the gospel. Let's pray. Father, as your story unfolds, would we not miss it? Then or now? Would we be attuned to the way that you have been fulfilling your mission from the earliest days? That, Lord, sin was not the final word, but that your mission began immediately. That you knew from before creation. Your Son knew before creation that he would be the Redeemer. The story unfolds to your people Israel, and it unfolds to us, Father. I pray that we would see that you did not spare your only Son, but gave himself for us, that he would be a ransom for many. Father, as we come now to celebrate communion, the Lord's Supper, may we remember this. I pray this in your name.